Right. So thanks for everyone for joining us. My name is Carlos Avia. I'm the Director of Business Development here at Multilingual Connections, and I'm going to just be doing a brief introduction as we get to the meat of our presentation today, which is about experience. And for that, I've got with me today Katie Bauman and Mariella Golan. Katie is our production director here at Multilingual Connections, and Mariella is the team lead for the research support services that we do. As we go through, please, if you have any questions, just put them into the chat, and we'll address them probably at the end of this presentation or at the end of the session today. You may have heard, if you joined us beforehand, that we're recording this today. I hope that's okay with everyone. The recording will be available to you if you would like it afterwards. You just send us an email and let us know, or put it into the chat that you would like to get a copy of that. So great. Next slide. The challenge that everyone that tends to come to us faces is that your organizations make a big investment in insights and research. Your stakeholders have very high expectations of what they're going to get from you when you do your research, and typically research projects take a long time to get approved from a budgetary standpoint, but then everybody wants insights immediately once the project has been approved. So establishing trust and preserving integrity are essential to delivering on those sort of conflicting demands. Your stakeholders have high expectations, and they want their insights yesterday. So this is really an enormous part of why your language partner is important. Establishing that trust and preserving the integrity across languages of the insights is really a matter of understanding language and culture whenever your research is international or covering multiple languages and culture. Today, what we're going to cover is the role of language in research. Most of our time today is going to be spent talking about some examples of what that looks like, what a language service provider can help you with. And we're also going to talk a lot about what a strong language partner looks like, and what kinds of things you should expect from whether you're working with Multilingual Connections or any other language partner for your research needs. So, I want to just take a minute to explain why we feel qualified to talk about this particular topic. And it's because research is really in our DNA, and it's the foundation upon which this company has been built. Dr. Jill Bishop, who you can see in the photo there, is a linguistic anthropologist who worked prior to founding this company in 2005 as a user experience researcher, for Sapient, and then helping Chipotle as a language and culture consultant. And from our beginnings, we have chosen to focus on research and the language services around research. It's not something that we casually got ourselves into. It's not something that we were pulled into. It's something that we chose to pursue from day one. And so, again, when we speak about these things, it comes from a long history, an intentional history, and a great deal of experience. So when you're looking at a language partner for research, you shouldn't just be thinking about translations. It's typically where people's mind go at first, is to the question of translations, but a strong language partner for research really should be able to not just do translations, but also help moderating focus groups or IDIs, or maybe helping you testing an app or designing an app for mobile journaling and things of this nature. It goes beyond mere translation and gets into, they should be a language and culture advisor for you. So we're going to get now into more brass tacks examples of what that looks like. I'm going to introduce again Katie and Mariella and let them take it from here.
Hi, so my name is Katie. As Carla said, I'm the production director at Multilingual. I've been at the company for about 7 years, and before that, I was a Spanish to English translator. And so before we dive into the specific examples and specific case studies, one thing that I just really want to emphasize is the importance of the human in the translation process, in the language service process. So successful research is always going to rely on clear communication, as Carlos was saying, to create a good participant experience and to gather insights that are really meaningful. But not all communication is created equal. So especially when you're working in multiple different languages. And so if you're using translation by a machine, by Google Translate, for example, or an inexperienced translator, it could lack the cultural nuance needed and it could miss the mark a little bit. And what this can result in is a poor participant experience. So maybe the participant incorrectly interprets the questions, or they don't even understand the questions. And then this can lead to insufficient or ineffective research outcomes. So in the first case study that we'll look at, my colleague Mariella is going to look at some detailed examples that can hopefully give this a little bit more color about how this cultural nuance and this linguistic expertise is so important in research translation.
Hi, everybody. This is Mariela. I'm a team lead with Multilingual Connections. I've been with the company for about 7 years also. So for the study that we're going to talk about now, our client, market research agency, was recruiting Gen Z participants in Japan to learn more about apps that people use and how they prefer to use them. To find eligible candidates for this project, they prepared 2 screeners in English, and participants who pass both screening phases would be invited to take part in a multitask project. As soon as we analyzed the screening questions prior to translation, and we actually had a native Japanese project manager working on this too, we realized that we needed to ensure the questions were relevant for the Japanese audience and that translation only wasn't gonna do the job in this case, and we needed to provide localization. That means that we needed to create a culturally appropriate Japanese version of the screening questions. So our approach here was to hire native Japanese linguists who actually were currently living in Japan, so they would be immersed in the culture and have a very good understanding of the market and the audience. And as a result, we were able to provide quick, accurate, and relevant localization of the questions so that they would resonate with the audience. So in the next slide, there's an example of a very common question in surveys. In this case, it's household income. So on the surface, demographic questions seem very straightforward and simple to translate. As you can see here, it's just numbers, right? But cultural and linguistic differences can bring challenges in translation that can muddy data if they're not addressed properly and in time. For example, some countries like Turkey, Russia, Peru, Argentina, among others, typically reference income as on a monthly basis and not yearly as we do here in the United States. And also some other countries reference their pay as after taxes are taken out, which is also different. So this was one of the questions, the first questions that we realized that we needed to localize. And that was done based on how income range is typically expressed in Japan. So to begin with, as you can see here, the amounts had to be converted into yen. And even though $1 is about 111 yen, we decided to round it to 100 for readability, because people in Japan are more used to seeing figures such as 1 million yen or 2.5 million, rather than the ending in nines as it's done for the US version. After conversations with our experienced linguists in the market, they also confirmed that income range is typically expressed as in a yearly basis, and that pre-tax income is typically used by default. So this digging into the specifics of the question and how the options would be interpreted by the participants was an additional step that we considered essential as a language partner, so that we could, so that our client could provide screening questions that would be very relevant and would get them the best answers from participants. The next slide, please. Thank you. Is about another question that is describing the participants' living situation. So the concept of roommates is common in Japan too, but Japanese people tend to room with friends, or at least people they know. So the idea of rooming with a stranger is becoming more natural, but since it's not an established trend yet, for this survey, we decided to change the option to living with friends instead. Also, age 20 in Japan is the equivalent to age 18 in the United States when it comes to drinking, voting, marriage without parents' consent, etc. So that's why it was changed there in the options to 20. But this is a question that could also be localized in different ways depending on what's common in different countries. For example, in countries like Colombia, Peru, Yemen, or Russia, it's common for people to live with their parents until they get married. So in this case, we could have suggested an option like living with an unmarried child over 18, for example, depending on the country, on the culture. So now Katie will continue with a different case study.
Thank you. So for this one, we'll zoom out a little bit, and instead of looking at specific language examples, look a little bit more at process. And specifically, this is a project process that we developed for one of our partners, who is a language strategy and communications firm. And some of their work entails surveying and interviewing populations of physicians and other medical professionals in different international markets in order to understand how to best craft language around new drugs. And so this is where we come in. We translate the surveys, the interviews, and the language strategy into other languages for these different markets. So what does this process look like? This is an overview here. And at the beginning is the project brief, which is essentially understanding the goals of the specific project. And so for that, we come up with some standard intake questions in order to get a sense of the goals for the project and identify any potential challenges. So we can look at the next slide. And this is just a sample selection of potential intake questions, and any translation partner that you're working with should be asking these types of questions at the beginning of a project, because getting these sorts of details are important for the translators to be able to make the best contextualized decisions while they're translating. So a few examples here: who is the audience for this translation? And this goes beyond thinking about what country or what market, but what region, what age group, for example, what socioeconomic group. All of these sorts of details help the translator make the best tone and style decisions or formality decisions when they're translating. And similarly, what is the goal of this translation? Where and how will it be used? As specific as possible of information as we can have here will will inform a better translation or localization. Is the text directed at one person or at multiple people? So in English, we don't have a singular and a plural you. When we say you, it could be at one person or multiple people, but many languages do. So knowing that is important for the translation to be accurate. How closely should the target translation match the source text, or how much liberty may the translator take to modify the text for the target audience and the target market? This is a very subjective question, but it's good to have this discussion with our clients at the beginning. Some clients have strong preferences here, especially if they're a language strategy consultant, for example, as in this case study. And some clients give us more liberty to modify it more to match the market. So this is not a black and white answer type of question, but more of a starting point for discussion. And then lastly, asking about glossaries or terminology preferences. This is always very important, especially for new clients. Usually for existing or repeat projects, we already have these sorts of resources developed, but for new clients, they might have already done some work in the German market. They might have some terms that they prefer in Germany, for example. And so if that's the case, we want to know that and make sure that we're being consistent. So jumping back into the process, the next step after we have these initial discussions, understand the goals, is then we align on the client reviewer process. So sometimes our client or the end client will have linguistic reviewers, people that want to be involved, native speakers of the language. They want to do a check of the translation. And so if this is the case, it's always good to know it at the beginning so that we can align on any tone preferences or terminology preferences, and also ideally have access to these people during the process for questions and conversation. After that, depending on the project size, we will sometimes hold a kickoff call to align expectations between the client and reviewers, potentially translator and multilingual connections. After that, we translate. So we have a translator as a first step, using all reference materials, glossaries, style guides, who goes through, produces the translation. We always have an editor, a second person with the same qualifications, going through the material, checking everything. And then we have a final quality assurance step by our project manager. One other important thing, if we have ongoing projects for the same client, we use the same translation teams across these projects. And so this, plus what we call translation memories and all of these resources such as glossaries, are what keep projects consistent and keep all the language consistent from project to project. The next step is translation review. So if there are end client reviewers, this is where they come in and double check everything. If there are any changes made, typically these are preferential. We make sure to save these in our system and adjust the tone and style guides moving forward. And then lastly, sometimes we will create new term lists at the end of a project. So if there are new terms introduced, such as a product or brand name, we can save this in a bilingual glossary for the client and ensure that moving forward, it's always translated the same way. And then one thing we've developed recently is the role of language strategist, specifically for this client. And we have a first project kicking off soon in Japanese. There's a Japanese theme throughout this presentation, in case you haven't noticed. And so what this is more of a consultant role than a translator role. And this person will either be involved after the translation stage to provide the client with some additional insight into how the language was translated, or they'll be involved before the translation stage. And so in this variation, what they'll do is analyze the client's language strategy in English and sort of help recreate it conceptually for the Japanese market before we translate. So this is part translation, part consulting, part research design. And really the goal is to say whether or not the language strategy developed is appropriate for the doctors and the healthcare professionals in this case in the respective market. So creating questions that feel natural and that can build trust with all the respondents is really important. Communication styles between Japan and the United States are very different. Japanese is a much more contextual language than English is, which means that there's much more that is left unsaid in Japanese. And so grammatically speaking, this can manifest as omitting subjects or objects from questions that are asked, for example, and other words. Using proper honorifics is also an important linguistic nuance to consider. And additionally, sometimes more follow-up questions are needed for the Japanese market in order to draw out additional information that might have remained unsaid in the initial answer. And so this is all insight that our language strategists can provide and can help add to the English strategy before it's even translated. And we can take a look at the next slide, and I'll hand it back over to Mariella.
Yeah, so for the end, we have some tips for global research success. So I'm going to go through it in general. So one of the main things is that even if your participant is proficient in English, they will very likely feel more connected to questions and express themselves better in their own language. And that's a way to build trust. That's why we think localization is so important, because participants will take their research more seriously and open up and give you more if the research feels close to them and it's in their language. Planning for translation in advance and include your language partner from the beginning is super important so that they can suggest the best approach. More importantly, the cultural nuance approach here. And it's also important that you share your goals, your budget, your timeline also with your language partner from the beginning, because that way they can give you the service, exactly the service that you need, not more and no less. So it's important for the language partner to have that big picture of what you're trying to achieve, to be able to help you from the start. Context is always super important for any type of translation, but here, if there's also localization, it's even more important. So any supporting material like facilitation guides, style guides, glossaries, and images. Images are usually not taken into consideration and are very important for context, especially when there's apps and websites involved. It's very good to see what the content will look like. And then, as we said at the beginning, humans matter. The machines are getting very close to providing accurate translations, but they still can't get the nuance of the language and achieve that content that feels like an authentic version in the target language. So human translation provides that extra to your content. So thank you all for listening. That was that was the end of the presentation, and I'll give it back to Carlos to continue.
Thank you, Mariella. So, and thank you, Katie, as well. That's really great practical experience that was related there, and we're going to head into the second half of our event here. But before we do that, I just want, if there's anyone that has a question they want to ask, you can leave it in the chat. If you have something you want to ask right now, you can unmute. We'll take at least one question here if we have one. And I also want to make sure that everyone knows that you can stick around and we can do questions and answers for both this content and the virtual tour that we're about to do after this virtual tour. So if there are any questions, either put them in the chat or unmic yourself now. I don't see anyone rushing to the mic.
I can if you're interested.
Yes,
What's
please
the
do.
difference if you have, so Carlos, you already know what I typically am looking at, but if I have something in English and I need it translated to Japanese, Korean, and traditional Chinese, how is that process different than translating to simply one other language?
So how is the process of going to 3 languages different than going into just one language? Is that the question?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
I can
yeah,
jump
Katie.
in there.
Yeah, please.
I mean, I would say essentially it's just you do it 3 different times. So we're going to ask you the same questions about who the target audience is specifically for Chinese, for Korean, for Japanese. We'll get different experts involved for each language. There might be, different questions might come up in the process, but essentially it's the same process. There's just more teams of people working on it. And there might be different questions and aspects that come up. Does that kind of answer your question?
It does. I know sometimes when you have that translation, you just do it once and you send it to several teams, or do you do it the same thing 3 times or whatever? So I was just curious what your particular method was.
So we would take the text or whatever it is in English, and we would have a Japanese translator and editor go through the Japanese process, a Chinese translator and editor go through the Chinese process, and a Korean translator and editor go through the Korean process, working separately. So we wouldn't like go to Japanese and then translate Japanese to Korean, for example. It would all be from the English source text.
You'd even have different questions because the markets might be different. You would be able to go ahead and adjust for that as well.
Yeah, so the end product, if you back translated, as we call it, from all 3 languages to English, would look different, because
That
it
makes
would have
sense.
been modified for each market.
That's exactly what I'd be looking for too. So perfect. Thanks.
Great. So thanks, Allison, for that question. Thank you for that.
Yeah, no worries.
Amanda has put a question into the chat. I'm going to read it out loud here. And this is probably for Mariella and or Katie. When writing and translating demographic survey questions, can the translator typically provide advice on possible sensitivities around certain choices offering depending on the country or region? Or is that something a language strategy consultant might provide, such as around gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, etc.? Just thinking about how in different places people may be more or less hesitant to share that info in a survey. I think it's a really, really good question, and it's at the heart of what I hope is the big takeaway for this presentation. I'm going to let Mariella or Katie answer that question. Maybe you can start, Katie.
Sure. I mean, that is a good question. And I'd say the answer is probably it depends, which is an answer everybody loves. But, sometimes, a lot of the times our translation teams who are working on this type of work, they have a lot of experience in market research. They have a lot of experience in this type of survey translation, and they do have that knowledge. I guess it depends like what level of detail you want to get into. If you want additional research to be done, that might be where we bring in someone with more expertise on the research side of things. But typically our translation teams are equipped and skilled to provide these recommendations. And it's a very good question. And especially gender, that's not just like a sensitive issue, but also a language issue. Translating into gender neutral language is a whole nother topic that could be for a separate webinar, in fact.
Mariella,
so let me know if that answered your question. Yeah, or Mariella, if you want to pop anything else in.
Yeah, I agree. I was going to say the same thing. Any translator that is a native of the target language will be able to provide some insight on those specifics, because it will jump out to them right away. But if there's more in-depth research needed, then we would have to involve a language strategist that can provide even more insight on the specific industry or the specifics of the research, because we're also talking about a specific age group or specific area of the country in question. It depends. Yeah.
Great, thank you both. And that makes a lot of sense, thinking about layering in the age group and how that could impact what choices you want to offer. Thank you.
Yeah, and Amanda, I would just follow up on what Katie and Mariella said, in that it's kind of it's a great question, because it's the big takeaway from this. And that is, these are exactly the kinds of things that you should be thinking about. And these are the types of conversations that your language partner should be able to manage with you. If they can't manage this conversation with you, independent of whether you and the language partner agree on one solution or another, if they can't maintain this conversation for you, you're talking to the wrong people. That's, I think, my biggest answer to this question is, like Katie and Mariella said, it depends. But what doesn't depend is whether this should be a conversation or not. This is the conversation, right? When it comes to research, because of what I said at the intro, which is, you've got in most cases very high expectations from your stakeholders and very little time in which to deliver it on. And so you can't waste time trying to figure these things out on your own. So I thank you for the question, because even if the answer isn't as complete or as black and white anyway as we might like it, the question is at the heart of what you're almost, the first question out of your mouth to the language service, or the language partner you're talking to. So thanks for that question. Okay, I see something else in the chat. I don't know. Yeah, exactly, Amanda. So I don't know. Are there any more questions for Alex or anyone else?
There's one more question in the chat.
Oh, I didn't see it. Thanks, Katie.
What are some key values and traits you look for in partners or linguists you may work with?
Wow.
So many good answers to that. Communication skills are the number one thing that jumps to mind for me as like top priority, in particular for like the language strategist role, which requires lots of articulation of very sort of complex cultural differences to people who maybe don't understand those. And also translating like whatever the original English intent is and totally transforming it for the target market. So just being able to do that one, but then also communicate what you're doing is really important. And that's sort of what we look for as a top trait when we're interviewing for these sorts of things. Mariella, do you want to add things there?
Yeah, I was going to say also collaboration, because we're working more and more with collaboration with a client directly. We tend to involve our linguists directly in conversations with the client so they can get the feedback or the information context they need directly. But we're also working with teams. So a linguist might have to be working with one or two other linguists in a project like this. And so that spirit of collaboration, whether it's in calls or with emails, comments on shared documents or anything like that, like, the collaboration and the professionalism in that area is important too.
And Jordan, I'm going to add one more thing to that, and that is when Mariella, in particular, because she kind of leads the effort when looking for research. When we're talking about research here today, not just any language context, but for that of research, we try to work as often as we can with people who have experience in the area, but at a bare minimum that they show an innate curiosity themselves. In other words, that they're people who are curious about the world around them, because it's the kind of mindset that researchers are looking for. And so if they can at least have that as a background, asking them questions that teases that out, that do you have that innate curiosity about the world around you, which frankly most linguists have, to be honest. Otherwise they might not be linguists to begin with, but it's not necessarily a given. And so teasing that out is also very important for this type of work. Great. Yeah. Well, we're well over time. I don't want to abuse anyone's time, but we're here, and we'll stay around answering questions as long as you'd like. Anyone who wants to stick around. Alex, I can't thank you enough. That was fantastic. It was really, really well done. Really well done.
Thank you very much, everyone, and just have a, I think, good day there. So it was good to meet you. Bye bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay, I think with that, we'll probably go ahead and sign off, everyone, unless there's any last minute questions. Thanks, everyone, for attending. Thank you, Jordan. Thank you, Allison and Olivier, Connie. Thank you for coming, everybody. Bye-bye.